Introducing NASM 1, NASM's ultimate membership program. Unlock access to everything your fitness career needs to succeed. Unlimited CEUs, free courses, access to our premium app, and exclusive discounts, all for $35 a month. NASM 1 is best-in-class tools, cutting-edge certifications, confidence in your craft, and everything you do as a personal trainer made easy, so we can achieve our greatest goals together as one.
You're listening to the NASM-CPT Podcast with Richey, winner of the Sharecare Emmy Award for Social Storytelling and the official podcast of the National Academy of Sports Medicine.
Y'all, and welcome to the NASM-CPT Podcast. My name is Richey, but today you've got a little treat because this particular episode, I'm being interviewed. This is actually an episode with my friend and colleague, Andre Adams. And Andre Adams is not just an amazing person, but now he's got a podcast with NASM. He's doing the bodybuilding, the physique and bodybuilding course that we had. Now there's a podcast that goes along with it. And every once in a while, Andre just sends me a message. He'll just text me something or he'll DM me on Instagram and he'll say, hey, have you seen this video? This guy says this. I'm not sure if that's true. Let me know your thoughts. And I will kind of, from my perspective or from a kinese or human movement perspective, I'll look at what they're saying and some of the claims, and maybe I get a chance to find some research on that specific thing. I'll look it up and I'll get back to him and I'll be like, shenanigans. That may not be something I agree with. So after a while, he was like, Rick, we got to get you on the podcast and we're going to do a MythBuster podcast. And so what he did is he sent me, 2, 3, 4 different video clips and said, this is kind of what these people were saying about it. I want to identify the truths in this or the embellished claims and see if there's any truth in what they're saying. So he took the concepts. We didn't show the videos or say this video. We just looked at videos, got content from the videos, and then he asked me questions about the movements, and I just said, let's bust some myths. So if you get a chance, when you listen to this podcast, pay attention to some of those bodybuilding myths, some of those human movement myths, some of those Instagram influencer myths, and then Andre gets to ask me about it, and y'all get to listen to me do my thing. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the episode, and I'll see you next time.
Hey guys, welcome back to another exciting episode of the Peak Physique Podcast. I'm your host, Andre Adams, NASM Master Trainer and IFBB Physique Olympian. Today, we've got a very special episode. We've dubbed this the NASM MythBusters episode, and I'm welcoming to the show for the first time one of my good friends, and actually I was on his podcast many times, Dr. Richey, also NASM Master Instructor and the host of NASM-CPT Podcast. Welcome to the show, Rick.
Andre, it's a pleasure to be here, my friend. Thank you for having me. It's good to see you.
Likewise. It's funny. I'm usually on that side of the screen, so today we get to mix it up a little bit.
I know. Congrats on the podcast. I'm really excited that you're doing this, and I'm very, very pleased to be on your show. And we'll do a little collab, so I'll run this episode on the NASM-CPT podcast to get a little more exposure for your new podcast, the fledgling podcast, and see if we can bulk it up a little bit.
Absolutely. I like that choice of words. And speaking of guests, it looks like we have an extra guest behind us. Who do we have joining the episode with us?
So this is funny. I have a bearded dragon always in the background of the show. I never mention him for the past 6 months or so. If you watch the NASM-CPT podcast on YouTube, he's there. You probably never noticed him before, but you noticed him because I pointed him out earlier. But chances are he just kind of slides by, never really moves during the podcast. In fact, I recorded a podcast about 3.5 hours ago, and he hasn't moved. That's where he's been the entire time.
And we did, for you guys that are tuning in, we confirmed he's alive, he's healthy, he's just chilling.
That's right. Put a little mirror under his nose and make sure.
That's right. He's doing well. So good to have you, brother. So today, you and I have chatted. It's funny, sometimes you and I will just DM each other this stuff, but the
Yeah.
topic for today I'm excited about. It's really going over some of the more trending or influencer exercises that we tend to see frequently on social media, and we want to look at that from more of an evidence-based standpoint, as we do with NASM, right? And teach people how to maybe assess which ones are potentially good exercises that add value, and maybe they're good variations to incorporate into their physique training. And then which ones maybe don't add value and are just kind of, they're just trending, right? Because they're maybe fun to
Yeah.
shoot, or people are just trying to get creative and think of new exercises. So,
Nothing wrong with
yeah.
creativity. Let me just throw that out there. Like if you're doing
Yep.
it, you could do something else, but you're being creative and it livens up the gym for you, then that's one thing. But if we're looking at optimizing things, then we'll pay particular attention to the choices that are being made.
Exactly. And then ultimately, right, we want to make sure we can maximize how much they're getting out of their physique training. And that's
That's
where
right.
I agree with you. If there's creative ways, this is how we evolve the sport and start to evolve our training and adapt new exercises, new variations. But we also don't want to put clients or athletes at risk either for injury, for maybe some silly movements that they should avoid altogether, because
Well said.
we've
Very
seen our
well said.
share of those as well. So
Indeed, we have.
yeah. So I'm thinking, let's kind of start at the top, Rick. When we're scrolling through our social media
Mhm.
and we come across new exercises, a lot of times they're really the same exercises, but done in a completely different way or a different modality. And let's maybe walk our followers through what our thought process is when we're analyzing what how effective or how safe an exercise is. And then, towards the end of the podcast, you and I are going to dive into like 2 or 3 very specific examples and walk through a full breakdown of those as well.
Yeah, that's great. I usually start with what is the function, right? So when I look at it, there's something called neuromuscular efficiency, and the the definition that I always put with that is the neuromuscular system's ability to produce, reduce, and dynamically stabilize in multiple planes at various speeds in a safe and coordinated fashion. So it's a hardy definition, one that I learned many years ago, and I think it's really valuable. And we can break that down. So the neuromuscular system's ability to produce, reduce, and dynamically stabilize. So that's concentric, eccentric, and isometric, right?
Yep.
In multiple planes, sagittal, frontal, transverse, in at different speeds, right? At various speeds in a safe and coordinated manner. So I think we got to start off with that. Are we producing, reducing, and stabilizing? Are we controlling it? Multiple planes, various speeds. Are you doing it safely? All of that stuff should be prioritized. And the first rule of anything, especially as a trainer, so you're out there coaching and training somebody, the first rule is do your best to not injure somebody else. That,
Exactly.
more than anything, more than results, is the not hurting somebody, because the not hurting, when you hurt somebody, you will most certainly not get the results. So minimizing, and everything's got a little risk versus reward, but there are generally safe exercises that we can do. And so that's kind of the overview. And then I always then take it to, what do muscles do? And if you will entertain me for a moment, I think we should point out that there are rules to muscles. Muscles follow rules. And if we follow the rules of muscles, then we will get more out of those muscles. So I remember I first started looking at rules of muscles, I had 3. There were 3 rules of muscles. Now I think there are probably more. So I'm going to give you a few more. But the first rule of muscles is that muscles only pull. Even when you push something,
Mhm.
the muscles are pulling. So they're actually getting shorter. So the term contraction, or a concentric contraction, they will contract or get smaller. So the ends get closer together. And that's the number one thing. Like the first thing we look at is that understanding that muscles will only pull, or they will slide over each other. The sliding filament theory, actin and myosin, these are Z lines getting closer together. So a basic
Yep.
rule of muscles. But also, rule of muscle that they only contract or relax. A muscle fiber doesn't kind of activate. It doesn't give you 20% force. When you engage a muscle fiber, that muscle, it will fire with every bit of what it's capable of doing. Now, you may only recruit a certain amount of fibers, but
Yep.
everyone that you do recruit is doing it at 100%. This is known as the all or none principle. So when a muscle is facilitated, it will contract at 100% intensity. All right.
Yep.
So that's a second rule of muscle. Muscles have two attachments, and at least one of those or at least two attachments, and then at least one of those attachment crosses a joint. And these 2 points are known as origin insertion, or my preference is there is a proximal and a distal attachment. So understanding this about muscles, muscles only directly move the joints that they cross. All right.
Right.
So now we're getting very specific, and we're going to have a conversation about this particular one a little bit later. But muscles will only directly, now they can indirectly move things, but they will only directly move joints that they cross. Muscles work best in the direction of their fibers. And so we can reciprocally inhibit some muscles. We can preferentially activate muscles by doing this where the muscles are engaging at a higher rate, at a better rate, more facilitated way when you align them with their fibers. And then there's another rule. It's a soft rule. It's that the insertion moves towards the origin, but that's not always true. So if I do a pull-up, the origin or the proximal attachment will move closer to the distal attachment. So I call it a soft rule, but because in general, the insertion will move towards the origin or the distal attachment moves closer to the proximal attachment. So there's just like ticking off about 6 rules of muscle. So if I understand that I'm looking for both efficiency and I understand what muscles do, then the last thing I need to do is just understand what we call functional anatomy, which is the body's ability to do all of that production, reduction of force, the stabilization of force. I have to understand what the muscle does. And that is done through familiarity with muscle actions, joint actions, what they do at joints when they engage, which ones stabilize, does it work better, and in what plane of motion, and then in what direction of fibers does it work better at. So a familiarity with the function of movement and learning a little bit of kinesiology along the way.
Absolutely. I love it, Rick. We're going to lay that foundation and definitely build upon that. And we're going to talk about that functional anatomy and some joint action and how that's going to relate, right? How can we leverage that for something like a specific goal, be it performance or physique training? So if you guys are just joining us, this is the NASM Peak Physique Podcast. I'm your host, Andre Adams, and I'm joined by my good friend, NASM-CPT Podcast host, Dr. Rick Richey. We are breaking down everything about, we're calling this NASM, kind of MythBuster style episode, but everything about trending influencer movements and what you need to know, right, when you're selecting a good variation for potentially some new or existing exercises. So Rick just kind of laid the foundation of how do our muscles physically work, right? We try to kind of back everything by evidence-based science and muscle anatomy. And I'd love to take this information and we're going to, use that to talk about how we can leverage that for competitive advantage and physique training. And I think, Rick, when we take a step back and we think about those joint actions, if we look at traditional exercises and then different modalities that mimic the traditional exercise, a lot of the joint actions, right, vector forces, where those insertions and origins are moving, a lot of it's really the same. And that's where I struggle sometimes because I look at things and I think to myself, well, that's an identical movement. It's just, your relative plane of motion. Maybe you're, standing upright versus laying down or things like this. But those are the areas where I think there's, potentially some really good things to think about. And then there's others that maybe it works well for the individual because they connect better, mind muscle connection, given a different modality of an exercise.
Yeah.
A few things too, Rick, I think we can maybe tack onto that. Let's add on, those main mechanisms of hypertrophy, right? So when we think
Yeah.
about taking a muscle through its range of motion and we're trying to achieve that hypertrophy or the, swelling of the muscles and cellular tissue, we've got like the primary ones, right? Most people are familiar with now with exercise-induced muscle damage or muscle trauma. We've got metabolic stress, buildup of inorganic phosphates and lactic acid and these types of stress. And then we've got, mechanical tension inside the muscle, to your point, where the muscle fibers, physically have tension, right? They're in this kind of pulling motion. And if we think about those three mechanisms, and then we look at these exercises, we got to think which one of these three mechanisms are they emphasizing? And if I can't
Good point.
directly relate it to one of these, that's where I usually question the effectiveness of the exercise. You mentioned potential risks. I think even thinking one step further of like, let's say it's a new exercise that's maybe unfamiliar, looking at potential regressions or progressions if you're training a client or an
Perfect.
athlete. And ultimately, maybe just trying it out for yourself, right? And then seeing how that movement feels in relation to or in comparison to an existing similar movement.
Absolutely. I think one of the least focused on variables when it comes to resistance training is tempo. And yeah, actually, that's not true. Most people focus on tempo and they'll do something quickly. I think in the world that you're in, things do slow down quite a bit more. And I think it's a great starting point to move slowly, to feel what the muscle is doing. And it's harder to feel that when you're going quickly. And it's harder to control it when you're going quickly. And it's harder to build up the stabilizers that protect the joints if you're moving too quickly. When you go slowly, a lot of the muscles engage around what you're doing. So the slower you go, and this is not a hard and fast truth. The slower you grow, the more you grow. That's not a necessary truth, but there's a lot of truth to that little maxim, which is you are engaging the muscle, you are creating mechanical tension, you are increasing the metabolites that build up in that. So the three versions of the requirements that you had mentioned for hypertrophy all work really well when you slow it down. And I think that is a great starting point. Now, certainly you can build up speed and you can start moving faster. But when we look at variables, the thing about variables is that they vary, they change. And if you're not changing your variables, if you're just staying constant, then we start to adapt. And when you adapt, we usually think of adaptation as a good thing. But once you adapt, then you get to the maintenance phase. So no matter what you're doing, if you keep doing the same thing over and over, you're just going to keep getting what you've already gotten. So you have to start creating variations and have your body respond different. And that's vital to our progressions.
Yeah, I think on a prior episode on your podcast, we had even touched on that, because that's an interesting point when we think about the adaptations, right? Our body's constantly in a state of adaptation, and we do need variety. We do need progressions. And then we do have some tools that potentially allow us to train even maybe similar or the same exercises, or, a similar OPT phase for longer by progressive overloading different mechanisms, right? We can progressive overload the weight, the intensity, duration. I love that you mentioned time under tension. That's your best friend in the world of bodybuilding, right? And we call it embracing the suck, right? Because it's going to hurt.
Yeah, that's true.
You got
a lot of truth to that.
So,
let me tell you something. One time I was in a gym. I think it was when I was down in Miami for about 6 months. I managed a gym down there, and I was like, Miami's not for me. And I came back to New York City with my tail between my legs. But when I was down there, there's some bodybuilders that were working out, and I laughed, right? Because there's so many times that me, as a generally smaller guy, will lift weights and I will be a little embarrassed around some of the bigger guys. Well, used to. I don't care anymore, but used to be embarrassed. And then I see these bodybuilders, and I'm telling you, this one guy, he's doing like a one-arm preacher curl with like 15 or 20 pounds. And of course, he may have done a volume of like 6,000 pounds worth previous to that. But he's preacher curling one arm, the lightest weight, and he is screaming, trying to get the weight up and doing everything super slow. And I was like, well, I guess I'm not going to feel bad about going light if this guy is like screaming his 15 to 20 pounds up on a preacher curl. So that definitely did something for me and my ego watching him, because clearly he's got the muscle.
Yep.
And he was just doing whatever finisher he needed to do at the end.
And that's the importance, sometime in the early days, like in the beginning, when you're first building the foundation of muscle, you tend to have to go a little heavier with like closed kinetic chain, compound movements, a little bit heavier weights at times to put that initial muscle on. However, once you've built that foundation, and I can personally attest to this through myself as both the athlete and the coach, it's a lot easier to maintain or make, improvements from that base with much lighter weights, stronger, you've built more neuromuscular control. You're able to tap into a deeper, mind muscle connection with each, we talked about the fibers of the muscles. I think you're able to just recruit more muscle activation mentally, and you don't need the crazy heavy weights. I mean, I probably lift like, you guys see the throwbacks in my videos where I used to do crazy stuff like, 600-700 pounds on deads and squats. And a lot of people don't know I used to bench press over 500 pounds just a few years ago. And it's funny, now I can maintain my size and even make improvements at about 50%, 60% of those weights without doing anything crazy. So definitely time and attention, slowing things down, and then good variety and progressions.
I love it. Yeah.
Rick, let's dive into our first exercise here. This one is one that I'm sure people have seen. And we're going to start with, talking about upright rows, but I'm also going to just maybe throw one or two additional exercises into the same bucket when we're talking about anything that involves, abducting the upper arm away from our centers. So a traditional upright row, probably the most common, I would say, is barbell, maybe even Smith machine. That's very common. We're starting to see a lot of trends now where there's people that would be laying back on, let's say, like a cable row, seated cable row, and they'll take the, the long bar, and you'll see them laying back, right, parallel to the rack, and doing their upright rows, laying flat supine facing the ceiling. And
so they're flat on the ground, lying down, like they're taking a nap.
Right. It can be on the ground. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
And even side laterals, right? I've seen that too, done in the same way, where lying flat on the back, on the ground, or on a bench. And I look at, so if you can imagine uprighting them, right, 90 degrees.
Yeah.
I look at the joint action and I think to myself, well, that's the exact same joint action as if they're standing straight up above the low pulley.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Right. So, this is, I think, a fun one for you and I to think through. Let's start with that same logic that we used, earlier. Let's talk about joint action. Do you see any benefit to joint action, or, the muscle insertion points moving closer to the origins, or any of these mechanisms?
Yeah. So when you do an upright row, you look at the joint action is just abduction in the frontal plane. So but the elbows are staying in. So the hands are staying in tight, the elbows are staying in tight, but it's really about the shoulders, and sometimes adding the shrug in there to get the traps involved a little bit more. So we look at upper traps and the deltoids primarily in this exercise. I think it's a good exercise. It's one that hosted a lot of fear mongering in the early days, especially even us at NASM. We're like, well, this is basically, if I go into that position in upright row and then I straighten my elbow out, that's an empty can test, which is how you test for a strain or a torn supraspinatus or supraspinatus muscle, the most commonly torn rotator cuff muscle. And so through that logic, we would say, well, if this is the test of how that muscle is hurt, then maybe doing this as an exercise is not a great exercise. But fortunately, we have research, and the research has really panned out to show that it doesn't cause any more damage to the arm. I think it's like a lot of things. You can have salt on your celery. You can have salt on your fries, whatever it is, unless you have high blood pressure, and then you probably shouldn't have so much salt. So it's not that the exercise is wrong. It's just that exercise might be wrong for some people. This is upright rows in general.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you know? Well, you start light, and if it antagonizes you, don't do it. And if it doesn't bother you, keep going. So as I would like to say, what's my range of motion on something? And we just say full available pain-free range of motion without compensation. So if you can follow that as a general rule for your range of motion, then I think that's pretty safe. So the upright row, I like it. It's a good exercise. The supine version of it, where you're lying down, it is the exact same exercise biomechanically for the movement, right? So my shoulders are doing the same thing. Maybe my scapula are doing the same thing. My elbows are doing the same thing. The only thing that changes, though, is that I don't really have to stabilize the weight with my spine, right? So if I have my back and my butt are supported by the floor when I'm lying down, then some people might be able to do potentially a little bit heavier weight because they're stabilized. Now, it's not a particularly easy position to get into. It's not that hard, but it's not a wrong exercise. I don't know if it is a game changer for anybody. I like it, but think about this too, Andre. Like if you're trying to do some type of finisher at the end, so you're doing a cable row, like a seated cable row, and at the end of it, you're doing a seated cable row with an overhand grip, right? So a pronated grip, and then at the end, you just decide to lean back and do some upright rows at the end because the other types of rows are completely gassed. Then you're just tacking on another exercise. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. It's a nice little contributor, but the difference between that standing version and the lying down version of the same exercise, not a lot of difference there.
Yeah, I tend to agree 100%, Rick. It's like, it's definitely not a bad exercise. I think, upright rows in general are good for, building up some roundness and fullness to the delts, adding some density, to that upper girdle. Great for any physique athlete. But to your point, when we compare a traditional standing, be it Smith, cable, barbell, upright row to this supine lying, I think maybe there's that bit of, stabilization, like you said, with the back and the glutes supported on the floor, but you're still getting you're actually still compacting the spine too in that scenario. So there's not a big benefit there. It's more just, like you said, if you feel like you get maybe a stricter movement out of it, where you can, connect a little bit deeper with those muscle fibers, maybe there's some benefit. But I tend to agree. The way that we train our physique athletes, generally we'll do the more traditional versions. But, if you want to add that in as maybe a finisher, lightweight burnout, maybe it's easier to do a drop set, with the cable stack.
That's a good point. Yeah, true.
Right. Yep. Selectorized weight stack. So definitely, I think it's got some value, but it's probably not going to change the way that your physique looks overall.
No, right. I agree. And then one other thing too, is if you think about it, if I start to get to my last one, I'm not a huge fan of momentum lifts, but if I get a rep and I don't get it all the way up, if I'm standing, I can do a little bump and just try to hold it there for a second and still get the eccentric. And I might be able to get another 2 or 3 where I lift up, I can't get it much higher. I get a little bump and then I can lower it down. And that benefit from the eccentric is pretty big. You don't get any kind of accessory movement when you're lying down like that. So it's not always the best thing because you always have to control it. So most of the times we're trying to limit people from doing those swings and the bumps. But I think that once you are really familiar with your body, with the movement, with the exercises, then you can add towards the end a bit of momentum, stabilize it, and then decelerate it to kind of finish out the set.
Eccentric loading. I hope you guys are taking notes. If you're just joining us, you are on the Peak Physique Podcast. I'm your host, Andre Adams, and we are here today with special guest, Dr. Rick Richey from the NASM-CPT Podcast. We've got 2 more exercises to review. Rick, I think we're on to something here. And, this might just have to be a recurring episode at some point because I get these requests. And here's what for you guys that are just tuning in, here's what really prompted the idea. Sometimes it's just us scrolling through our news feed and taking note, like, that could be an interesting exercise, or there's a lot of videos that tell you an awful lot without telling you anything. So then my natural curiosity wants to go a little deeper. But most of all, a lot of the athletes, so my athletes that are tuning in are probably going to laugh because they send me these videos and ask my thoughts. And I think this is a fun, review to have on, a certain cadence. But exercise number 2 that we're going to break down today is going to be our glute bridge hip thrust, right? Everyone's familiar with baking those cakes, as we've dubbed it, right? Rick, maybe, gosh, it might have even been 2 years ago now. You and I kind of went down this, glute function and glute training with a good friend of ours, right? Dr. Sonny Andrews was on that episode with us. And glute bridge, hip thrust, some of the, probably the primary 2 influencer movements that you'll see on, on the gram. And I think they're 2 of the most effective exercises for building density to the glutes. Also going to have some inherent benefits in the hamstrings, especially biceps femoris, right? We're going to get also into even a bit of the outer quads, right? Vastus lateralis. And there's been a lot of studies done on both of these exercises. I'd like to break them apart, glute bridges or hip thrusts. And, Brett Contreras has been out there, right? There's been the Dynavet Gluteator team, right? The Jeff Case both there. They've done a lot of work in measuring like EMG activity, studying the specific muscle anatomy and function. And long story short, a lot of the data conflicts. And so it's one of those, this is like quantum mechanics, right? You get the result that you're looking for. And if you think about the physics behind it, or physiology behind it, if we're doing an exercise, Rick, and let's say I take you through a glute bridge and I'm cueing you to, right, we're going to put a mini band around the knees and I'm cueing you to have a bit of, femoral rotation and get a bit of abduction, squeeze your outer glutes. If we measure that activity, 9 times out of 10, we're going to read more activity in the outer glutes because I'm telling you to flex your outer glutes, right? Versus if you did the same exercise without me giving you those cues, you might get a totally different reading. And this is where I think it becomes interesting. Now, one of the things that we've seen trending more recently is there's debate, from some notable figures in the industry that maybe you shouldn't be doing glute bridges at all. Maybe it's, if you look at the anatomy and look at the spine, right? There's some people that tend to think that it's more, back extensors that, are getting more of the work, when we tuck in the posterior pelvic tilt at the top of hip thrust. So it's a complex joint, right? Many joints are involved. Many smaller muscles are involved. Let's break this one down, Rick. What do you see, happening in the glutes, primarily when we tuck into posterior pelvic tilt at the top of a hip thrust? And then let's talk about maybe the ideal setup that we would recommend for glute development.
Yeah, I like the idea of the posterior pelvic tilt because it just gives you a fuller range of motion with that. Now, it makes a lot of sense in a hip thrust. It doesn't make really very much sense in a squat. Doesn't make really that much sense kind of as you lift into a deadlift, but you see people at the end of a squat tucking, but they're tucking against no resistance. Right. They're being loaded vertically, and then they do a posterior tilt against nothing in front of them. So that doesn't make any sense. But in a glute bridge, it does, because you're doing the tilt directly against the resistance pushing down on your hips. So I think it's a great cue. In fact, it's something that for a very long time, you'd hear neutral spine, neutral spine, neutral spine. I was like, well, neutral spine is good, except for if I go into a posterior tilt, I might not be a neutral spine, but I do engage the muscle more. So neutral spine is for the rest of the spine at that point, not for what's going on at the hips. And as you go into a posterior tilt, the line of your back, the lordosis, starts to disappear, and it flattens the back versus keeping that slight arch in the low back. It tends to do better for what's going on with the glutes. Now, the argument that is made, and listen, when I say argument, an argument is not necessarily enraged, right? So an argument is that you present your point and you try to back it up and you try to make a logical case against it. A lot of the stuff that we're talking about right now has not been focused on in research, so you don't see a lot about what's going on comparing things like the amount of spinal extensor activation in a bridge versus a deadlift. But if you do a bridge and your spine engage, your spinal erectors engage, that's okay. They're supposed to. That's what they're supposed to do. You're supposed to stabilize your spine. It's the same thing as if you go into a deadlift. And if you're doing an RDL and, you know, maybe some people on the planet somewhere are like, don't do RDLs because it's a lot of pressure on your back. But like that's the point of it. You're supposed to engage your entire posterior chain. I ain't mad at you. I want that to happen. Now, the difference is, are you doing 405-pound bridge and a 225-pound deadlift? That's a big difference on what's going on at the spine. But generally speaking, that 225 is a lot further away on the fulcrum, like where you're holding the weight, than the bridge is. The bridge tends to be shoulder blades a little bit below the shoulder blades, and of course, the shoulder joints themselves that are holding the RDL weight is further increasing the lever length that's on your back. So I don't think technically there's going to be a lot more engagement in one versus the other, the bridge versus the RDL. And if it is, it doesn't necessarily mean that's a bad thing. We have fear around the back because we have been taught so much to fear what's going on in the back and protect your back. Yes, you need to protect your back. That's what you've already mentioned in the podcast, Andre. You've said progressive resistance training at least once, maybe twice. So let's say it again, progressive resistance training. Do what you can, not what you can't. And there are a lot of people out there in the gyms, Andre, doing what they can't do and not what they can do. So I think that as we mentioned, take it back a little bit, slow the tempo down, get that mind-muscle connection, focus on what you're trying to do. And that posterior tilt there will also help to engage the glutes, particularly at the end. Now, the hard part is, can you try to maintain gluteal engagement while lowering down in a hip bridge? And that feels nearly impossible. So that's your next mind-muscle connection task, is can you maintain engagement while decelerating that force?
Right. And I think that's the key, Rick, is it's really about managing the amount of resistance that we have in that vertical plane. You can still add the mini band too, especially if you're just getting used to it. And and if if you don't have let's say completely like a really strong mind muscle connection yet, maybe you're newer to training with these types of movements, it can definitely show some benefits. And as long as you keep that, the loading across the hips moderate, once you get to a really heavy weight, let's say you see the influencer videos where there's 4, 5, 6 plates on, at that point, you're already recruiting as much as that glute possibly can recruit. So the mini band effectively doesn't add a bunch of value, but I think slowing it down and then, thinking about the motion, right? So think about the upper thigh bone, right? That femur going into that hip. And as you're coming up into hip extension, when you start to then add that extra layer by getting posterior pelvic tilt, we're effectively shortening that chain, right? We're putting a harder contraction through the glutes, even into that, hamstring tie-in area, which that's gold for the ladies, right? And guys too, but especially the ladies, they're scored directly on these areas. And I think that was some of the rebuttal in the industry where there's, some healthy dialogue and debate going on. Is there benefit to PPT at the top of this glute bridge or hip thrust, or is it just taking away from your movement? And, I think among ourselves, we probably vote unanimously. There's certainly value if you're using a controlled enough weight with good form at the top when you're in that extension, right? Getting into posterior pelvic tilt. There's a few other cues too and I know we're running a little short on time, but I want to get on into other cues that we've recently heard, right? You'll hear everything from traditionally drive through the heels. So the foot would be, the ankle would be into dorsiflexion versus, drive through the full foot or even on the toe in plantar flexion on the ball of your feet. And these are, some concepts that are definitely unfamiliar. And I don't think there's been a lot of actual studies around them, but let's start with a basic setup and kind of leave our audience with what we think the ideal cues and setup are. I think starting with the knees, approximately 90 degrees of flexion at the knee, right? I like to take the stance, so the width of the feet, roughly neutral with the hips, maybe even slightly wider than hip width, depending on the individual. And then let's work from there. So foot posture, what differences or changes do we see in the way the muscles work with the toe pointed up in the dorsiflexion versus down in the plantar flexion?
Yeah, so I like what you mentioned. If I go into this position for my bridge and my heels are directly underneath my knees, which I think is a pretty good thing. You mentioned 90 degrees at the knee. So that's the thing when you lift all the way up in 90 degrees at the knees. If you put the feet too far away, you're going to feel it more in your hamstrings. If you bring them a little too close, it's going to be a lot in the knee. So I think 90 degrees is a safe place. Now, if I decide to keep that 90-degree bend at my knee, but then I plantar flex and I go up on the ball of my foot, that now takes me not directly underneath my knee, but the direction that force is put out, however long your foot is, 5, 6, 7 inches away from your ankle, then you're moving the lever length away. And that will generally tend to engage the hamstrings a little bit more because the length tension relationship, as you start to lengthen the hamstring will then get more involved in it. So there's a tendency there. I think it's I think it's a good exercise. I just don't think that it is, I don't think it's not as focused on the glutes. Your glutes are still going to work. When you feel it more in your glutes, your hamstrings are still working. All of these muscles engaging are okay. But if you're trying to prioritize, if you're trying to preferentially activate something over something else, then another thing you may want to do is feel it out for yourself. Right? Like you're going to find what works better for you. I think what's important for us initially in the learning phase, Andres, we always say, we're going to do it this way. This is the way we're going to do it. This is our general setup. And that's the recipe. However, when you get to be pretty good at cooking, then you get to make up your own recipe and you do what works better for you, for your palate, for your taste, and for your outcomes. So there's nothing wrong with the other ways of doing it. I do think that driving through the heel will generally provide more glute activation, but it may not for everyone. So that's why we give kind of templates for people, templates for exercises, templates for programming, templates for movement. But it's not dogma. And the moment we start turning it into dogma is when we stop with the creativity, and we have to minimize dogma and we have to work on what works for everybody. Individually, what an individual, not just saying, here's our blanket, this is our movement and how we do it.
Yep. No, I think you're right, Rick. When I think through that, just visually, if we start out with the traditional hip thrust glute bridge, let's say the ankle's neutral or slightly driving through the heel and a dorsiflect ankle position, if we start to then push into plantar flexion, and again, you're moving further away from that lever point, right? It changes the way the muscles work. And then what's responsible for plantar flexion, right? It's about 2/3 soleus, 1/3 gastroc. And if the gastroc's pulling, we got overlap with those hamstring insertions. Guess what? The hamstring's under more tension. So I would agree 100%. I think you take some of that emphasis off the glute and you start to distribute it among, other parts of the lower leg and the hamstring. So, definitely neither are bad exercises by any means. It's just which muscles are you trying to emphasize in the movement? So I know we're running low on time. The last thing we're going to talk about real quick, Rick, does higher EMG. So when we measure the muscle activity, right, does higher EMG and muscle tension generally lead to more hypertrophy, or is that null and void and there's really no change?
I think that there's debate, and this is one where, again, you look at the research. Some people are going to pull out that EMG studies will show the level of contraction, and that level of contraction equates to, right? And then But the argument being made is that you can isometrically contract muscles as well, and you'll get a really high EMG, but you're not going to get really good hypertrophy out of an isometric contraction. That being said, when we do studies in EMGs and people are doing exercises and you see an exercise that gets stimulated more, not through the mind muscle connection of it, right? So I'm doing EMG studies. Let's say we're doing it on step ups and we're doing it on deadlifts and we're doing it on hip thrust and we're doing it on squats. And none of this, I'm going to give you a cue. Don't focus on the glutes. Let it do what it do. And then we're going to measure it. And through that measurement, we see that there are really high percentages of maximal voluntary contraction. Then that's a pretty good indicator that you are under the mechanical load, that you have the tension in the muscle, and you didn't even have to think about it. Now, the nice thing about it is that then we can start focusing on it and we can add increased focus and contraction. And I do believe that there is a place for that. And I think that the EMGs actually give you a really good idea of what to do. Now, I did just talk about this on my podcast, and I will also say this because this is something that I pointed out, that if you look at activations of certain muscles on EMGs, and then you get some other exercises that are lower on the EMG scale, and you look at those exercises, they're really good exercises, then I would say prioritize the ones that are going to give you higher EMGs, and then use the other ones as accessory lifts to give you a little variety in your workout, because the variety is the spice of life, and it might spice up those glutes or those biceps or whatever else you're trying to work on too.
I love it. Rick, it's been a pleasure as always. I think everything that we talked about today is relevant and useful. And I definitely foresee some subsequent episodes on this topic because there's so many other exercises to break down. And we encourage you guys that are listening. There's really no right or wrong way. These are specific to your individual goals and outcomes. And hopefully you have some clarity on which ones maybe add value and help you get there a little bit faster, and which ones maybe are not for you. Right. So we encourage you guys, keep being creative, keep trying new and different things for yourselves. Always send us feedback or any future topics that you'd like us to break down. So thank you guys. Make sure to check out Dr. Rick Richey also on NASM-CPT Podcast. And we will see you guys back on a next episode of the Peak Physique Podcast. Signing off.